Karen stomped into the hushed library, her designer heels clicking against the polished marble floors. Approaching the circulation desk, she slammed her hand down, demanding the attention of the startled librarian. "You there," she barked. "I need you to do something about all this dreadful silence. It's driving me insane." The librarian, a meek woman named Mrs. Pemberton, blinked in bewilderment. I'm sorry, ma'am, but this is a library. Silence is right to the point." Karen scoffed, tossing her perfectly coiffed hair over her shoulder. "Well, it's unacceptable. I simply can't concentrate with all this quiet." She gestured around the vast, peaceful space, her manicured brow furrowed in disgust. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in a noisier environment," Mrs. Pemberton ventured, hoping to diffuse the situation. "Of course not," Karen snapped. "I come here to read, not to be assaulted by the sound of silence. Now, do something about it at once." The other patrons, engrossed in their books, glanced up in alarm at the commotion. Mrs. Pemberton wrung her hands, unsure of how to respond to such an unreasonable demand. "I'm afraid I can't very well turn down the books, as you put it, ma'am," she said apologetically. "That would disturb the other visitors." Karen's eyes narrowed to icy slits. "Are you suggesting that my needs are less important than theirs?" She gestured dismissively at the other library goers, who quickly averted their eyes. "And no, of course not," Mrs. Pemberton stammered. "I simply can't." "Well, then you'll have to find a solution, won't you?" Karen interrupted, her tone dripping with disdain. "I refuse to be subjected to this oppressive quiet any longer." The librarian hesitated, her mind racing. She couldn't very well turn up the volume on the entire library, but she also couldn't bear the thought of angering this irate patron. Glancing around, her gaze settled on a small set of earplugs available for the hearing impaired. "Perhaps these would help," she offered tentatively, holding out the tiny orange plugs. Karen recoiled, her face a mask of outrage. "Earplugs? Are you serious?" She leaned in, her eyes glinting with menace. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Mrs. Pemberton shrank back, suddenly aware of the eyes upon them. I'm afraid I don't, ma'am. But I am Karen Whitaker, the wife of Councilman Whitaker," Karen interrupted, her voice dripping with disdain. "And I will not be treated like some common nuisance." The librarian's heart sank. Of course, the Whitakers were a prominent family in the community. She should have recognized the name. Glancing around at the other patrons, she knew she had to find a way to appease this difficult woman. "Please, Mrs. Whitaker," she pleaded, "I'm simply trying to maintain the peaceful atmosphere that all our visitors expect and enjoy. Surely there must be some way I can." "Enough of your excuses," Karen snapped, her voice echoing through the stunned silence of the library. "Either you find a way to quiet this infernal silence, or I shall have your job. Do I make myself clear?" Mrs. Pemberton swallowed hard, her mind racing. She couldn't possibly turn up the volume without upsetting the other patrons, but the thought of losing her job was equally terrifying. Glancing around helplessly, she realized there was only one thing she could do. "Very well, Mrs. Whitaker," she said, her voice trembling. I'll do my best." Mrs. Pemberton reluctantly stepped out from behind the circulation desk, her hands shaking slightly. With a deep breath, she made her way to the center of the library, conscious of every eye upon her. Clearing her throat, she addressed the room in a wavering voice. "Excuse me, everyone. I'm afraid we're going to need to adjust the noise level in the library for a moment." A collective murmur of confusion rippled through the patrons as they looked around, puzzled by the unexpected announcement. Karen stood back, a smug smile playing on her lips as she watched the librarian's obvious discomfort. Approaching the nearest bookshelf, Mrs. Pemberton began to slowly and deliberately slide the books back and forth, creating a soft, rustling sound. Several visitors glanced at each other in bewilderment, unsure of what was happening. Satisfied, the librarian moved to the next shelf, repeating the motion and gradually increasing the volume. The rustling grew louder, gradually filling the once tranquil space with a persistent hum. Across the room, Karen folded her arms, nodding in approval. Much better, she purred, settling into a nearby chair and retrieving a magazine from her oversized handbag. The other patrons, however, were growing increasingly agitated. One elderly gentleman cleared his throat, shooting Mrs. Pemberton a reproachful look. "Excuse me, but what on earth are you doing?" he demanded. The librarian paused, catching her breath. I'm terribly sorry, sir. But I'm afraid I must insist on a bit more noise in the library for the time being." "Noise?" the man spluttered, his face reddening. "This is a library, young lady. Quiet is the very essence of the place." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Mrs. Pemberton felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. I know. But you see, there's a special request." She glanced nervously in Karen's direction, hoping the woman would come to her aid. But Karen merely raised an eyebrow, flipping the page of her magazine with an air of disinterest. "Don't look at me," she drawled. "I'm simply enjoying the ambience." The elderly patron shook his head in dismay. "This is outrageous. I've never heard of such a thing in all my years." He turned to the others, his voice rising in indignation. "Surely I'm not the only one who finds this completely unacceptable." One by one, the other visitors began to voice their protests, the library filling with the sound of disgruntled murmurs and the occasional frustrated exclamation. Mrs. Pemberton felt her heart sink as the situation spiraled out of control. "Please, everyone, I'm sorry," she pleaded, her voice barely audible over the growing din. I don't know what else to do." But the patrons were having none of it. Casting furious glares in Karen's direction, they began to gather their belongings, shuffling towards the exit in a huff. The Whitaker matriarch, meanwhile, remained firmly ensconced in her chair, flipping through her magazine with an air of studied indifference. As the last disgruntled visitor stormed out, Mrs. Pemberton sagged against the circulation desk, her face buried in her hands. She had never felt so utterly defeated. "What have I done?" she whispered, her voice thick with despair. The library lay in silence, save for the occasional rustle of Karen's magazine pages. Mrs. Pemberton stood behind the circulation desk, her hands trembling as she replayed the disastrous scene in her mind. How could she have let things spiral so far out of control? Glancing around at the empty tables and eerily quiet bookshelves, she felt a deep sense of shame wash over her. This was her domain, her sanctuary, and she had allowed a single overbearing woman to turn it into a mockery. "Well, that was certainly entertaining," Karen drawled, breaking the heavy silence. She casually tossed her magazine onto the desk, fixing the librarian with a pointed stare. "I must say, you handled that rather well." Mrs. Pemberton felt her jaw tighten, anger bubbling up beneath the surface of her despair. "With all due respect, ma'am, I did not handle that at all. I've never been so mortified in my life." Karen leaned back in her chair, seemingly unfazed by the librarian's distress. "Nonsense. You did exactly as I asked, and the results were quite satisfactory." She flashed Mrs. Pemberton a sly smile. Admittedly, the reaction of the other patrons was rather more dramatic than I had anticipated. But no matter. The important thing is that I was able to enjoy my time in peace. Mrs. Pemberton stared at the woman, dumbfounded. "Enjoy your time in peace? But you've driven away every single visitor in this library." She gestured around the cavernous space, her eyes wide with disbelief. "How can you possibly think that's a satisfactory outcome?" Karen shrugged carelessly. "Well, it's not as if I had any pressing need to be here, is it? I simply came to indulge in a bit of light reading, and your creative solution allowed me to do just that." She fixed the librarian with a pointed stare. Besides, it's not as if the rest of these people were doing anything particularly important. I highly doubt their reading habits will be missed. Mrs. Pemberton felt her hands clench into fists at her sides, her knuckles turning white. Not important, she repeated, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. These are our loyal patrons, the very lifeblood of this library. And you've driven them all away, without a moment's thought for the consequences. Karen's eyes narrowed, a hint of irritation creeping into her previously casual demeanor. Now, see here, Mrs. Pemberton, or whatever your name is. I am a highly respected member of this community, and I expect to be treated with the utmost deference. If a little noise-making is what it takes to ensure my comfort, then so be it. Comfort? Mrs. Pemberton scoffed, her composure finally crumbling. You've single-handedly destroyed the tranquility and sanctity of this library, all because the silence was too loud. She shook her head in disbelief. Do you have any idea how many people depend on this place? How much it means to them? Karen merely inspected her perfectly manicured nails, exuding an air of indifference. I'm afraid I don't particularly care. As long as I was able to enjoy my time here, that's all that matters. Mrs. Pemberton felt a sudden, overwhelming surge of pity for the woman. Pity mingled with a deep, simmering anger. How could someone be so utterly lacking in empathy, so completely disconnected from the needs of others? It was infuriating, and yet, in some twisted way, it was also profoundly sad. Swallowing hard, the librarian fixed Karen with a steely gaze. Well, I'm afraid I can't allow you to continue disrupting this library, Mrs. Whitaker. I must insist that you leave. Immediately. Karen's head snapped up, her eyes widening in disbelief. Excuse me? She sputtered. How dare you? I've made my decision, Mrs. Pemberton interrupted, her voice firm. Either you leave quietly, or I shall have no choice but to call the authorities. For a moment, Karen seemed lost for words, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Then, with an indignant huff, she snatched up her magazine and stormed towards the exit, her heels clicking furiously against the marble floor. As the library doors slammed shut behind her, Mrs. Pemberton felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. She had stood up to the Whitaker matriarch and lived to tell the tale. Now, she just had to figure out how to lure her patrons back and restore the library to its former glory. Karen stormed out of the library, her rage boiling over. How dare that insufferable librarian defy her? She was Karen Whitaker, the wife of a prominent city councilman. Her demands should have been met without question. Fuming, she climbed into her gleaming Mercedes and peeled out of the parking lot, determined to give Mrs. Pemberton a piece of her mind. As she drove, her mind raced, coming up with increasingly outrageous plans to punish the librarian for her insolence. Who does she think she is? Karen muttered under her breath, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the steering wheel. I'll make sure she never sets foot in that library again. Pulling up to the Grand Whitaker estate, Karen slammed the car door and marched up the long, winding driveway. Bursting through the front door, she found her husband, Councilman Whitaker, in his study, poring over a stack of documents. Darling, she exclaimed, her voice dripping with affected sweetness. I'm so glad you're home. I have the most dreadful news. Councilman Whitaker looked up, his brow furrowed in concern. What is it, my dear? Has something happened? Karen launched into a dramatic retelling of the incident at the library, painting herself as the wronged party and Mrs. Pemberton as an insolent, power-hungry tyrant. By the time she had finished, the councilman's face was flushed with outrage. Unacceptable, he thundered, slamming his fist on the desk. That librarian had no right to speak to my wife in such a manner. I shall see to it that she is removed from her position immediately. Karen smiled, inwardly reveling in her victory. Oh, darling, I'm so relieved to hear you say that. I simply couldn't bear the thought of that woman continuing to mistreat me. Councilman Whittaker rose from his chair, his expression grim. Rest assured, my dear, I shall handle this matter personally. No one disrespects a Whittaker and gets away with it. Placing a gentle hand on his arm, Karen gazed up at him with adoring eyes. I know you will, my love. You always take such good care of me. As her husband strode out of the room, determined to right this perceived wrong, Karen couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt. She knew that her behavior at the library had been, well, perhaps a bit excessive. But surely, she reasoned, the ends would justify the means. After all, she was a Whittaker. She deserved to be treated with the utmost deference. Settling into the plush leather chair, Karen picked up a crystal tumbler and poured herself a generous helping of her husband's finest scotch. Swirling the amber liquid, she took a deep sip, savoring the burn as it slid down her throat. That'll teach that interfering old biddy, she murmured, a triumphant smile spreading across her face. Little did she know, her actions were about to set in motion a chain of events that would test the very foundation of her privileged existence. The next morning, Mrs. Pemberton arrived at the library feeling a mix of trepidation and determination. After the disastrous events of the previous day, she knew that Karen Whittaker's wrath would likely be swift and unforgiving. As she unlocked the front doors and stepped inside, the librarian was greeted by an unexpected sight. The library was teeming with patrons, all quietly engrossed in their books and periodicals. A warm sense of relief washed over her. Clearly, word of the incident had not yet reached the community. Hurrying to her desk, Mrs. Pemberton began the familiar routine of checking in returns, reshelving books, and greeting the regulars. The peaceful hum of activity calmed her frazzled nerves, and she found herself almost forgetting the looming confrontation with the Whittakers. That is, until the grand oak doors burst open, and a livid councilman Whittaker strode in, his wife in tow. You there, the councilman bellowed, his voice echoing through the once tranquil space. I demand to speak with the librarian in charge at once. All eyes turned towards the circulation desk, where a trembling Mrs. Pemberton stood rooted to the spot. Squaring her shoulders, she made her way around the counter, moving to meet the irate politician head-on. I am the librarian in charge, she announced, her voice steadier than she felt. How may I assist you, Councilman Whittaker? The councilman's eyes narrowed, his jaw set in a hard, determined line. You can start by explaining to me why you saw fit to mistreat and disrespect my wife yesterday. I've been informed that you threatened to have her arrested. A ripple of shocked murmurs swept through the library, and Mrs. Pemberton felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. Glancing around at the curious onlookers, she knew she had to tread carefully. Councilman, I can assure you that I never threatened to have your wife arrested, she said, her tone measured and calm. I simply asked her to leave the premises after she insisted on disrupting the peace and quiet that our patrons expect and deserve. Karen, who had been hovering behind her husband, let out an indignant huff. Disrupting the peace. I did no such thing. I merely requested that you find a way to alleviate the oppressive silence in this mausoleum. Mrs. Pemberton turned to face the Whittaker matriarch, her eyes narrowing. With all due respect, ma'am, this is a library. Silence is essential to the purpose and function of this institution. Your request was simply unreasonable and disruptive to the other visitors. Councilman Whittaker's face darkened with fury. Unreasonable, he spat. My wife is a pillar of this community, and you had the audacity to dismiss her concerns and drive her out of this place. He took a step forward, his finger jabbing accusingly at the librarian. I demand that you issue a formal apology, and that you make it clear to all of your staff that the Whittakers are to be treated with the utmost respect and deference. Mrs. Pemberton felt her heart sink. She had known this confrontation was coming, but the sheer force of the Whittakers' indignation was still overwhelming. Glancing around at the anxious faces of her patrons, she realized she had no choice but to stand her ground. I'm afraid I cannot do that, Councilman, she said, her voice soft but firm. I was simply upholding the rules and standards of this library, which apply equally to all our visitors. I will not issue a special apology or grant your family preferential treatment." The color drained from Councilman Whittaker's face, replaced by a deep, simmering rage. "You leave me no choice, then," he growled. "I shall see to it that you are removed from your position, effective immediately." Mrs. Pemberton felt her stomach lurch, but she refused to let her fear show. "With all due respect, sir, I am the head librarian, appointed by the city council. You do not have the authority to terminate my employment." The councilman's eyes narrowed to slits, his lips curling into a menacing sneer. "We'll see about that," he hissed. Turning on his heel, he stormed out of the library, his wife hurrying after him. As the heavy oak doors slammed shut, Mrs. Pemberton felt a shiver of dread run down her spine. She knew the Whittakers would not take this lying down, and she feared that her days as the head librarian were numbered. Over the next few days, a palpable tension hung over the library. Mrs. Pemberton found herself constantly on edge, jumping at every creak of the front doors and every unfamiliar footstep in the hallway. The Whittakers' influence in the community was formidable, and she knew it was only a matter of time before they made good on their threat. True to her nature, Karen wasted no time in rallying her allies to her cause. She hosted a lavish luncheon at the Whittaker estate, inviting several of the city's most prominent socialites and power brokers. Under the guise of casual conversation, she skillfully poisoned their minds against the meddlesome librarian, painting Mrs. Pemberton as an arrogant, power-hungry tyrant. "Can you believe the nerve of that woman?" Karen lamented to her rapt audience, dabbing delicately at the corners of her eyes with a lace-trimmed handkerchief. "To think she actually had the audacity to throw me out of the library, and in front of all those other patrons, no less." The other women gasped and murmured sympathetically, their perfectly coiffed heads shaking in dismay. One particularly well-connected matron, a close personal friend of the mayor, clucked her tongue and patted Karen's hand consolingly. "My dear, that is simply unacceptable. No one should be treated that way, especially someone of your stature and influence." Her eyes narrowed shrewdly. "Something must be done about this librarian. The community deserves better leadership at such an important institution." Karen nodded gravely, her expression one of utter innocence. "I quite agree, my dear, but I'm afraid I'm at a loss as to how to proceed. Surely there must be some way to remedy this injustice and restore order to the library." The other women nodded in solemn agreement, each silently plotting ways to leverage their own connections and resources to bring about Mrs. Pemberton's downfall. Karen sat back, a subtle smile playing on her lips as she sipped her perfectly chilled mimosa. Meanwhile, unaware of the storm brewing on the horizon, Mrs. Pemberton continued her daily duties, tending to the library's patrons with her usual quiet efficiency. She had hoped that the Whittakers' outburst had been a one-time occurrence, but as the days wore on, she found herself constantly on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Then, one morning, her worst fears were realized. As she unlocked the front doors and stepped inside, she was greeted by the sight of the mayor himself, flanked by a contingent of city officials. "Mrs. Pemberton," the mayor said, his expression grave, "I'm afraid we need to have a word with you." The librarian felt her heart sink, but she steeled her resolve, squaring her shoulders as she stepped forward to meet the unwelcome visitors. "Of course, Mr. Mayor. How may I assist you?" The mayor cleared his throat, casting a wary glance around the suddenly silent library. "It's come to my attention that there have been concerns raised about the leadership and management of this institution. Concerns that, I'm afraid, I can no longer ignore." Mrs. Pemberton felt the blood drain from her face. "Concerns?" she echoed, her voice trembling slightly. "What kind of concerns?" The mayor's lips thinned into a tight, uncomfortable line. "Well, it seems that certain members of the community, including prominent figures like Councilman Whittaker, have expressed dissatisfaction with your handling of library operations. They've made a compelling case that a change in leadership may be warranted. Mrs. Pemberton stared at him, her mind racing. She had known this moment was coming, but the reality of it was still devastating. Clenching her fists at her sides, she fought to keep her composure. "I see," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And what, pray tell, do you intend to do about it?" The mayor shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering to the silent officials behind him. "I'm afraid, Mrs. Pemberton, that the city council has decided to relieve you of your duties as head librarian, effective immediately." Mrs. Pemberton felt the world tilt on its axis, the words of the mayor ringing in her ears. Relieved of her duties, effective immediately. After decades of dedicated service, was it all to end in such an abrupt and humiliating fashion? Swallowing the lump in her throat, she forced herself to meet the mayor's gaze, her eyes brimming with a mixture of sorrow and defiance. "With all due respect, sir, I hardly believe this decision is justified," she said, her voice measured and controlled. "I have served this library and this community with unwavering commitment for over 20 years. Surely a few isolated complaints do not warrant such drastic action." The mayor shifted uncomfortably, his expression pained. "I understand your frustration, Mrs. Pemberton, but the decision has been made. The city council feels that new leadership is necessary to address the concerns that have been raised." "Concerns?" Mrs. Pemberton scoffed, unable to contain her indignation. "Concerns from a handful of self-entitled socialites who couldn't bear the thought of a little peace and quiet." She took a step forward, her chin raised defiantly. "This is nothing more than a blatant abuse of power, orchestrated by Councilman Whitaker and his ilk." The mayor held up a hand, his expression hardening. "That is quite enough, Mrs. Pemberton. I understand your feelings, but this decision is final. You will be escorted from the premises immediately, and a new head librarian will be appointed in the coming days." Mrs. Pemberton felt her heart sink as two burly security guards stepped forward, their faces impassive. Fighting back tears of rage and despair, she allowed them to guide her towards the exit, her footsteps heavy with the weight of her impending dismissal. As she passed through the library's grand, oak-paneled doors for the last time, she cast a sorrowful glance over her shoulder, her gaze sweeping across the familiar shelves and the faces of the bewildered patrons. This had been her haven, her sanctuary, and now it was all being torn away from her. Stepping out into the bright, sunlit streets, Mrs. Pemberton felt a bitter sense of betrayal wash over her. How could the city council, the very institution she had served with such unwavering loyalty, turn their backs on her so callously? And all because of the whims of a petty, entitled woman like Karen Whitaker. As the reality of her situation sank in, Mrs. Pemberton felt a surge of righteous anger, her grief giving way to a burning determination. She would not go down without a fight. Squaring her shoulders, she set off towards City Hall, her mind racing with a plan to reclaim what was rightfully hers. Meanwhile, back at the library, a triumphant Karen Whitaker strode through the grand entrance, a self-satisfied smile plastered across her perfectly made-up face. Approaching the circulation desk, she leaned in, her eyes glinting with malicious glee. "Well, well, well," she purred. "Looks like your little reign of terror has come to an end, Mrs. Pemberton. I do hope you've learned your lesson about respecting your betters." The remaining patrons, stunned into silence by the abrupt dismissal of their beloved librarian, could only watch in dismay as Karen Whitaker strolled through the library, her every step a testament to her newfound power. But little did she know, Mrs. Pemberton was just getting started. With the fire of righteous indignation burning in her heart, she was determined to take the fight directly to the Whitakers, and she would stop at nothing to reclaim her rightful place as the head librarian. Mrs. Pemberton's footsteps echoed with purpose as she strode through the grand marble halls of City Hall, her expression grim but resolute. She had spent the past several days gathering evidence, rallying support from the community, and preparing her case. And now, The moment of reckoning had arrived. Approaching the imposing oak doors of the mayor's office, she took a deep breath and knocked firmly. A muffled voice beckoned her to enter, and she pushed the door open, squaring her shoulders as she stepped inside. The mayor, seated behind his ornate desk, looked up in surprise. "Mrs. Pemberton," he said, his brow furrowing. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." "Mr. Mayor," she replied, her voice steady and unwavering. "I'm afraid I have a matter of the utmost importance to discuss with you." The mayor leaned back in his chair, a wary expression crossing his face. "Very well, then. What is it you wish to discuss?" Mrs. Pemberton took a step forward, her gaze fixed on the man before her. "I'm here to appeal my dismissal as head librarian," she announced, her tone brooking no argument. "I believe the decision was made in haste, without proper consideration of the facts, and under the influence of outside parties with a clear agenda." The mayor's eyes widened, and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Mrs. Pemberton, I can assure you that the decision to remove you from your position was a difficult one, made after careful deliberation by the city council." "Careful deliberation?" Mrs. Pemberton scoffed, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Forgive me, Mr. Mayor, but I find that hard to believe. The Whittakers have been systematically undermining my authority and reputation for weeks, and I have evidence to prove it." She reached into her bag, withdrawing a thick folder and placing it on the mayor's desk. "These documents detail the Whittakers' efforts to rally influential members of the community against me, as well as the numerous complaints and concerns they have raised, all based on a single, isolated incident that I handled appropriately and in keeping with the library's policies." The mayor's brow furrowed as he flipped through the documents, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "This is quite concerning, Mrs. Pemberton. If what you're saying is true, then the city council may have acted hastily and under undue influence." "That is precisely my point, Mr. Mayor," Mrs. Pemberton replied, her voice firm. "The Whittakers used their power and connections to orchestrate my dismissal, simply because I refused to cater to their entitled demands, and I won't stand for it." The mayor sighed, rubbing his temples wearily. "I see. Well, this certainly complicates matters. I'll need to review these documents thoroughly and bring the city council back together to reevaluate the decision." Mrs. Pemberton felt a surge of hope, but she knew the battle was far from over. "I appreciate your willingness to reconsider, Mr. Mayor, but I must insist that my reinstatement be made retroactive, with no gap in my employment or benefits." The mayor nodded slowly. "Understood. I'll make sure the council takes that into account as well." He paused, leveling Mrs. Pemberton with a serious gaze. "You know, Mrs. Pemberton, you've always been a dedicated and respected member of this community. It pains me to see you forced to fight for what is rightfully yours." "As it should, Mr. Mayor," Mrs. Pemberton replied, her expression softening ever so slightly. "This library and the people it serves are my life's work. I couldn't simply stand by and let it be undermined by the whims of a privileged few." The mayor nodded, a hint of admiration creeping into his expression. "Well then, I'll be in touch as soon as the council has reached a decision. In the meantime, I'd suggest you keep a close eye on Mrs. Whittaker. I have a feeling she won't take this lying down." Mrs. Pemberton allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. "Oh, I can assure you, Mr. Mayor, that I'm more than ready for whatever she might have in store." With that, she turned and strode out of the mayor's office, her steps lighter than they had been in weeks. The battle was far from over, but she had taken the first step towards reclaiming her rightful place, and this time she had no intention of backing down.